You got close. Maybe you got all the way there. The thing you said you wanted, the relationship, the position, the version of yourself you rehearsed in private, arrived. And then something happened that you have no clean explanation for. You pulled back. You manufactured a conflict that didn't need to exist. You found the flaw in the opportunity before anyone else could. You left before it could leave you, or you stayed and made sure it fell apart in a way that looked accidental. You call it fear of commitment, self-destruction, bad timing. Maybe you've borrowed the language of trauma to explain it. Unhealed wounds, unresolved attachment, not ready yet. Those explanations aren't wrong. They are not deep enough. This isn't about fear of failure. You've failed plenty. Failure is familiar. Failure is, in a particular and uncomfortable sense, safe. This is about what happens when your system detects something more dangerous than failure. The possibility that you might actually become someone different from the person you have always been. This video won't give you a way out of that. There is no technique that fits at the end of this. What follows is a precise description of the mechanism operating inside you when success becomes the threat your system mobilizes against. The sabotage isn't the problem. It's the solution. That's the part that hasn't been named clearly enough. The common frame for self-sabotage treats it as malfunction, something going wrong inside a person who, if corrected, would simply proceed toward what they want without interference. Therapy targets the behavior. Coaching targets the belief. Productivity systems assume the architecture is sound and the obstacle is external. That frame misidentifies the direction of the mechanism entirely. The sabotage is not the system breaking down. The sabotage is the system working correctly, protecting something it was built to protect, executing a function it was assigned long before you had any say in the assignment. The distinction matters because a malfunction can be repaired. A protection cannot be removed without first understanding what it was installed to defend. What the system is defending is not comfort. It is not laziness. It is not fear of work or fear of visibility or fear of judgment, though all of those may be present. The system is defending your identity. The specific, stable, internally consistent model of who you are. Built over years, maintained at significant cost, and tied directly to your prediction of what you can safely be in the world. Success doesn't feel like a rival to that system. Success feels like obliteration. In the late 1980s, a psychologist named Jennifer Crocker began studying what happens to self-esteem when people succeed in domains where they have built their core self-concept. Her subjects were students who defined their worth through academic performance, students who, by external measures, were succeeding consistently. The expected finding would be consistent success stabilizes self-esteem. The data showed the opposite. Consistent success in identity-defining domains produced elevated anxiety, increased vigilance for failure, and significant behavioral interference, choices that undermined the very performance the person was invested in maintaining. The subjects were not sabotaging out of ambivalence. They were sabotaging because their identity was now on the line in a way it wasn't when they were simply trying. Trying is low risk. Succeeding, and then being seen as someone who succeeds, makes the identity legible, readable, exposed to revision. What Crocker's work kept revealing across nearly a decade of studies is this: the threat is not failure. The threat is visibility into who you actually are, now that you've performed who you said you were. There's a layer of that data that almost never makes it into the popular version of this research. It arrives later in this. Your brain maintains what neuroscientists call A self-model, a predictive architecture of who you are, how the world responds to you, and what outcomes you can expect to occur. The structures most involved are the medial prefrontal cortex, the default mode network, and the anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors for prediction errors. The self-model is not an accurate portrait. It is a functional tool built for efficiency. It predicts, it pattern matches, it flags anomalies. Success, real success, the kind that rewrites the expected narrative, registers as an anomaly, a prediction error, a signal that the model is wrong about something fundamental. The anterior cingulate doesn't evaluate whether the anomaly is good or bad. It evaluates whether the anomaly is consistent with the existing architecture. A large prediction error triggers a threat response regardless of whether the outcome is objectively positive. The system mobilizes to restore coherence. Coherence is the priority. Accuracy is secondary. Sabotage restores coherence. It confirms the model. It stops the rewrite before the rewrite destabilizes something the system has no map for surviving without. This is not pathology. It is engineering. Functional, coherent, self-preserving engineering that was calibrated to an environment that no longer exists. Think about the environment that built this system, not the environment you live in now, the earlier one. There was a version of you, much younger, with no framework yet for understanding what was happening, who learned something about what it costs to be visible, to succeed, to exceed the expected shape of yourself in that particular room. Maybe success meant separation. You moved past something, someone, and the distance that opened felt like abandonment in both directions. You learned that becoming more meant becoming alone. Maybe success attracted something dangerous, attention that was not safe, expectation that became a weight the child version of you couldn't carry. You learned that visibility was exposure, and exposure was risk. Maybe the environment had a fixed ceiling on who you were allowed to become, not a declared ceiling, an atmospheric one, the kind enforced through subtle deflation, through comparisons that always tilted a specific way, through the particular silence that followed your achievements. What did you do with your own momentum in that room? Where did you redirect it? What did you learn to want less obviously? The system that now protects you against your own success was installed then, before you could evaluate it, before you had the vocabulary to question it. The installation was silent and total. Here is the part that requires precision, not comfort. The system that is sabotaging you now was not a mistake. In the original environment, the one where it was built, it was a solution, an intelligent, adaptive, functionally accurate solution to a real problem. The child who learned to contain their own success was protecting something that genuinely needed protection. The regulation was real. The threat that generated it was real. That matters to say directly. The mechanism was correct for the conditions that produced it. Here's the part that does not follow from that. Understanding the origin does not update the system. The architecture remains calibrated to the original environment. The threat map was drawn in rooms you no longer live in, but the map is still the one your system consults. Knowing this does not turn off the response. Knowing this does not make success feel safe to a system that learned decades ago that it wasn't. Both things are simultaneously true. The mechanism was intelligent. The mechanism is now limiting you. Neither fact cancels the other. They simply coexist, without the resolution you were hoping to find somewhere between those two sentences. Return to Crocker's data, the layer that rarely surfaces outside the academic literature. In follow-up studies examining subjects over multiple years, a pattern emerged that her earlier work had only suggested. Individuals with high contingent self-worth, people whose identity was tightly fused to specific domains of performance, did not simply underperform when threatened. They restructured their investment. They stopped trying in ways that were measurable and covert simultaneously. The subjects were not aware they had stopped trying. They reported continued effort. The behavioral data showed systematic withdrawal, reduced engagement at exactly the moments when success was most achievable. What was running was not conscious calculation. The withdrawal was automatic. The system had identified the threshold at which success would require identity revision, and it stopped the approach before revision became unavoidable. Here is the implication that almost no popular summary of this work includes. The system learns the exact threshold. It identifies the specific altitude at which the threat becomes critical, and it begins intervening below that altitude, early enough that the intervention looks like ordinary ambivalence, ordinary distraction, ordinary misfortune. The sabotage is calibrated. It knows exactly how close to let you get. Willpower is not the intervention. The system runs below the level at which willpower operates. You can want something intensely, sincerely, with no trace of ambivalence you can locate consciously, and the system will root around the wanting. Accountability structures don't reach it. The mechanism isn't activated by absence of witnesses. It runs just as precisely when people are watching, when the stakes are public, when failure would be visible and costly. Visibility increases the stakes, which increases the threat, which accelerates the intervention. Reframing the goal doesn't reach it. The system is not responding to the object of the goal. It is responding to the identity revision the achievement would require. Rename the goal, restructure the timeline, change the metric. The system reads the underlying implication and responds to that. The question is not, why can't I stay disciplined? The question is, what identity is this success threatening to end? That is not a more comfortable question. It is a more accurate one. Accuracy is the only thing on offer here. You know the moment this is describing, not the big dramatic sabotage, the one you can retrospectively explain as a breakdown or a bad decision made under pressure. The smaller one, the message you drafted and didn't send. It was ready. You read it 3 times. You closed the application. The meeting you prepared for, genuinely prepared for, and then said something in the first 5 minutes that you knew would shift the room against you before you'd established anything. The relationship that was going well, noticeably well, and the thing you did, not catastrophic, not inexplicable, but precisely calibrated to introduce friction at the exact moment it stopped feeling uncertain. You don't know why you did those things. You have explanations. The explanations are all slightly off. The system knew the threshold. It intervened. You experienced it as a decision. It was not. The cost of this mechanism is not a single catastrophe. Single catastrophes are visible. They can be grieved. They have a shape and a location in time. The cost of this is different. It accumulates in negative space. The opportunities you stopped pursuing before anyone could see you pursue them. The version of yourself you kept partially constructed, close enough to maintain as a possibility, never close enough to risk becoming real. The relationships that stayed at a manageable depth, not broken, not intimate, maintained at exactly the distance at which the identity remained stable. You built a life around the perimeter of what you could safely be. The territory inside that perimeter is livable. It is, in many respects, functional. The doors at its edges, the ones that open towards something larger, you stop standing in front of them so gradually that the withdrawal never had a name. The map got smaller. The reduction was quiet. There is a finding that surfaces rarely in the public version of this mechanism. Identity protective sabotage does not weaken with age without direct intervention. The studies that track subjects longitudinally over 15, 20 years show the opposite. The system becomes more efficient. The intervention threshold drops. The protection activates earlier, more automatically, with less internal signal that anything has been redirected. The longer the architecture runs without revision, the more invisible the revision becomes to the person running it. The path that appears, therapy, sustained relational work that consistently contradicts the threat model, deliberate exposure to the exact altitude the system avoids, is slow. It is nonlinear. It does not produce the experience of insight dissolving the pattern. Insight and pattern coexist for a long time, sometimes indefinitely. There is no version of this where understanding is the exit. Understanding is only the beginning of knowing precisely what you are dealing with. The mechanism is still running. It ran during this entire description. It is already deciding what to do with what was just said. You started with a word for it, self-sabotage, a behavior with no good explanation. You still have the behavior. Now you have the mechanism. The system was built to protect a self that no longer needs the protection it was designed for. It does not know that. It knows its function. It executes its function. The version of you that stayed small enough to survive, that version is still at the controls. Success is still the threat. The sabotage is still the solution. The only thing that has changed is that you now know what is being protected and what the protection costs. The identity that organized around not having, not becoming, not arriving, that structure does not disappear when the threat does. It finds new threats. It recruits suffering as a foundation. The next layer of this mechanism is the one that operates even deeper. The identity built entirely around pain. The personality that cannot exist without it. The self that would dissolve if the wound closed. That is a different architecture, and a more difficult one. It's what the next video examines. Watch it.